Defense of Intelligent Design, ID. Addressing the limitations of evolutionary mechanisms and supporting ID as a scientific pursuit. Intelligent design, ID, argues that random mutation and natural selection are insufficient to explain the origin of biological complexity. This defense will provide examples where evolutionary mechanisms fall short and will explain why ID qualifies as a scientific hypothesis. It will address common misunderstandings about ID's relationship with science and demonstrate why ID offers testable, falsifiable claims. We'll also address claims that ID is rejected by the scientific consensus and argue that scientific progress often emerges from challenging that consensus. Finally, we'll defend ID against the accusation that it is a God of the gaps argument and support the idea that biological systems exhibit specified complexity, pointing to an intelligent cause. Random mutation and natural selection. Insufficient for explaining biological complexity. The mechanisms of random mutation and natural selection, the foundation of Darwinian evolution, are not sufficient to explain the origin of biological complexity, especially in systems that exhibit irreducible complexity. For example, consider the bacterial flagellum, a molecular machine that functions like a rotary motor, requiring all its components to be in place for it to work. Random mutation and natural selection work well to explain small adaptations, but the idea that a system like the flagellum could arise incrementally through step-by-step changes presents a major challenge. If even one part of the flagellum is missing, the entire system becomes non-functional. Natural selection cannot favor non-functional intermediate stages, which makes the gradual development of such systems implausible. Another example is the genetic code itself. DNA is an information-rich system, with nucleotide sequences encoding for the production of proteins. The probability of random mutations leading to a functional sequence of DNA that codes for a specific protein is astronomically low. As ID proponents argue, the specified complexity found in DNA, which requires both complexity and a meaningful arrangement, points to an intelligent source. ID qualifies as a scientific pursuit. A common criticism of ID is that it does not qualify as a scientific hypothesis. However, this is a misunderstanding. ID makes falsifiable claims and follows the evidence wherever it leads. Here's why ID is a valid scientific pursuit. Falsifiable claims. ID posits that certain biological systems, such as the bacterial flagellum or genetic code, are too complex to have evolved through gradual natural processes. If empirical evidence were presented showing how these systems could evolve step by step without requiring all parts to function simultaneously, this would falsify ID's core claims. However, such evidence has not been found. Following the evidence, ID follows the evidence from information theory and molecular biology, which suggests that systems with specified complexity, like DNA, require an intelligent cause. This is analogous to how we recognize design in human-made systems. The hypothesis doesn't presuppose a religious conclusion, but instead looks for the best explanation for observed complexity. Misunderstandings about ID's relationship with science. A major misunderstanding is that ID is somehow inherently anti-science, or that it seeks to replace scientific inquiry with religious dogma. This is simply false. ID is not about rejecting natural processes. Rather, it argues that natural mechanisms like random mutation and natural selection are insufficient to explain certain phenomena, and that an intelligent cause is a more plausible explanation. ID proponents engage in scientific research and publish in academic journals, though they face considerable resistance due to the prevailing scientific consensus. ID isn't opposed to science. It seeks to apply the scientific method to test hypotheses about the origin of complexity in life and the universe. ID and scientific consensus. Challenging the majority view. One of the primary criticisms of ID is that it is rejected by the scientific consensus. While this is true, it is also important to note that scientific progress often comes from challenging consensus views. Several historical examples illustrate this point. Heliocentrism. When Copernicus and Galileo proposed that the Earth revolves around the Sun, They faced strong opposition from the scientific consensus of their time, which favored a geocentric model, germ theory of disease. The idea that microscopic organisms caused disease was once ridiculed. Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch eventually overturned the prevailing consensus and revolutionized medicine. Plate tectonics. The theory of continental drift was dismissed by many scientists when it was first proposed by Alfred Wegener. Only decades later, with the discovery of seafloor spreading, did the scientific community accept plate tectonics. These examples show that challenging consensus can lead to scientific breakthroughs. The fact that ID is not part of the current scientific consensus does not mean it is wrong. It simply means that it is challenging orthodox views, much like other revolutionary ideas in the past. Biological information requires an intelligent source. A core argument for ID is that biological information, such as the genetic code, requires an intelligent source. In information theory, specified complexity refers to an arrangement that is both highly complex and meaningful. Human experience tells us that specified complexity always arises from intelligent agents. For example, the letters in a book or lines of computer code have both complexity and purpose, and they are always the result of intelligent design. The genetic code exhibits the same characteristics. DNA contains specific sequences of nucleotides that encode the instructions for building proteins. The chances of these sequences arising through random processes alone are astronomically low. This is why ID proponents argue that the information content in DNA points to an intelligent source, as naturalistic mechanisms have not been shown to generate such specified complexity. Defending ID against the God of the gaps. Accusation. One of the most common criticisms of ID is that it is a God of the gaps argument, that it merely fills gaps in scientific knowledge with a divine explanation. However, this is a misrepresentation of ID. ID is based on positive evidence for design, not just gaps in our understanding. For example, irreducible complexity is a positive observation of systems that require all parts to function together. This suggests design, much like how a mousetrap requires all of its parts to catch a mouse. It's not simply an argument from ignorance, it's an argument from what we know about complex systems. The fine-tuning of the universe is another positive observation. The fact that the constants of the universe are precisely calibrated to allow life suggests that an intelligent cause is responsible. This isn't about filling a gap in knowledge, but rather making a logical inference based on what we observe. Rebutting co-option and defending design. Evolutionary biologists often point to co-option as an explanation for how complex biological systems evolve. Co-option suggests that parts of simpler systems were repurposed over time to form more complex systems. For instance, it is argued that the bacterial flagellum evolved from a simpler structure called the type 3 secretion system. However, this explanation has several flaws. Lack of evidence. While the type 3 secretion system shares some components with the flagellum, no empirical evidence shows how the other parts of the flagellum could have been co-opted in a way that would lead to a functional rotary motor. Specified complexity. The flagellum is an example of specified complexity, where all parts must work together to achieve a specific function. The co-option explanation doesn't account for the specific arrangement of the flagellum's parts, which suggests intentional design. Conclusion. ID as a valid scientific hypothesis. In conclusion, intelligent design is a valid scientific hypothesis that makes testable predictions and offers empirical evidence for the origin of biological complexity. ID challenges the limitations of random mutation and natural selection and provides positive evidence for design in biological systems like the genetic code and bacterial flagellum. It is not a God of the gaps argument, but is based on observable phenomena and scientific principles. Just as scientific progress has often come from challenging the consensus, ID offers an alternative explanation that deserves serious consideration within the scientific community.